All right, welcome everyone to today's office hours. This is part 4 in our Configuring Edge series. Today we're going to be talking about using the Edge configuration tool. Now the Edge configuration tool builds on the rest of what we've been talking about in our 4-part series. For those of you who have been joining us for the past series, you might find that we will talk about some of the same things that we've mentioned previously. The Edge configuration tool, in a nutshell, gives us more detailed settings on the Edge format itself. By Edge format, I mean the definition of what data fields are available in Edge and where they will map in the Equus database. Now, among the different things we can set or configure with this configuration tool are enumerations, format fields, tabs, and some other settings as well. I'll talk about each of these a little more in depth before we go right into Edge and show a demonstration about how to use the tool. So first, enumerations. Enumerations are essentially a way to provide another way to provide a lookup list for certain fields. So we have already reference values that come from Equus, which will allow us to define some valid values for certain data points that we might be asking for in Edge. Enumerations provides yet another way to limit the list or the vocabulary we're going to use on certain data fields. Let's take a quick example. If you want to record weather conditions, but you'd prefer to have your users record them with specific language, such as rainy, sunny, hailing, or others, we could set up an enumeration with those values so that it's easy for them to grab the correctly worded response. We'll also use the configuration tool to do a variety of things on format sections. Format sections is basically looking at the organization of which data fields are available in Edge for data entry. Configuring format sections means we can do a number of things. We can essentially change how they behave when they're in Edge, such as making certain fields required, setting some sort of a default on those fields, as well as configuring the lookups that a certain field might have. Like I mentioned previously, we could use enumerations to define a list of valid values, so we can look up to those. We could also make a field look up to a reference table or even to other format sections. We can also use the tool here to filter those drop-downs to be more specific to our needs. As time permits, I'll also show how to set up file attachment on certain data sections, but we'll visit that when we get there. Configuring tabs in the configuration tool allows us to recaption them, just to make the look and feel of Edge just what we want it. We can designate certain tabs or forms for certain locations. The example I have, and I'll show you later, is to have a groundwater sampling form only accept new records if you're at a monitoring well. You can also use this tool to disable any of the many tabs that Edge has that you won't be using. And the benefit of this is, 1, to simplify setting up Edge, but 2, it can shorten startup time since there's less for Edge to load up when you're starting Edge. And finally, there are some other miscellaneous settings we'll find in the config tool. One is to enable live data. Live is referring to Equus Live, an Equus module that's geared towards managing high volume or high frequency data, such as those coming from data loggers. We can change things like which color of highlighting we want for certain varieties of errors and where the error highlighting will occur. We can migrate our settings and configuration. We can also change some captions on general fields that we find throughout Edge. Okay, so from here, let's go into a demonstration. I'm going to close out of here and hop over to Edge. First and foremost, let's discuss where you find the Edge configuration tool. Once I've opened Edge, I'll go to the Plugins ribbon at the top of Edge and click Edge Configuration. So from here, we have a number of options on the left-hand side as well as at the very bottom of this window. And we'll see more in the main window once we select what we're going to be working with right now. Let's start with enumerations. I see from the left I have enumerations, and I've got a little plus sign node. Let me click on that to take a look at what enumerations are already here. Now, as I discussed, an enumeration is basically a list of values. We can use it to define a list of valid values for a certain field. Take, for example, we have a number of these here, say battery type, and the members of this enumeration are alkaline or lithium. So if we have a data field where we're supposed to be entering which type of battery it is, we could point it to this enumeration so that we are accepting alkaline or lithium, and those are the values that you choose from. To show you how to configure enumerations, I'll go ahead and create a new one, which will show us all the different things we can do. You can always edit any of these that are listed on the left-hand side. But to create a new enumeration, I'll go to the bottom, which now has buttons for enumerations. I'll click the new button to start a new list. Now I'll enter some sort of a name so that I can find it again. Maybe I will call this weather underscore descriptor. I'll click OK. It asks me to decide how long of values I want to have in here, meaning like the length of characters for each member of the list. Sometimes you might set up lists that are just like yes, no, or not applicable, and so you only need a few characters long. In my case, I'm going to use whole words, so I'll overestimate and maybe allow for 50 characters in my member list. I'll click OK, and it doesn't seem like it's done anything, but that just means I need to find my new enumeration in my list. They're sorted alphabetically, so let me scroll down to the W's. And here's my weather descriptor enumeration, and doesn't have any members just yet. I can add to that list by going down to the bottom of this pane and clicking Add to List. And I simply enter whatever value I want to have as part of this list. So let's say I want to have rainy as one of my options. I'll click OK. I also want to have cloudy. Let's say clear. And last but not least, hailing, which would not be very fun to be in real conditions. If the order matters to you and which order they're presented, you can select any of these members, go down to the bottom, and you can push value up or value down to reorder them in the list. You can also remove anything you put in there or edit the text value on that particular member. So that's how we use this to configure enumerations. Let's go on to format sections. Format sections is referring to the different kind of organizational tables that are in the Edge format. So these are all, this is where all of our data fields are defined, essentially. Now, we're not going to be changing where data maps to in Equus or anything like that, but we are going to decide what kinds of features Edge is going to show us when we are entering data into those fields. So there are a number of sections here, a pretty hefty list, in fact. For my example, I'm going to be thinking about a field sampling event that I'm going to be doing, and I'd like to make sure that the form has the right kinds of drop-downs, has certain fields required, and that sort of thing. If I look on my list of format sections, I see that there's a field sample section. I'll click on that, and when I do, the main pane of this configuration tool shows me a listing of all of the different fields that are available in this section. So in essence, I'm looking at all of the data points that Edge can capture for field sampling. I expanded the name here so I can see what kinds of data fields there are. In fact, let me sort this maybe alphabetically to see. Actually, I clicked off of it and back on so that I could get it back to the default sorting it had. It's actually a little bit handy because it shows me some of the more used fields to begin with, and then going down the way. So a few things we can do in here. We can change the caption on certain fields. Now keep in mind that anything we do here, it's going to change this wherever it happens in Edge. So whether we have, whether we're using the tabular view of field samples, or if we're using a field sample form, like the ones that we learned how to configure in last week's session, the caption that we put in here will reflect over there. So let's say, for example, this syssample code, it seems kind of awkward to have that name at least listed in the form itself. It would make more sense to my users to have it be sample ID instead. I'll go ahead and enter that here. Other things you can do is to set a default on certain fields. We can see already any of these values that are highlighted in red are settings that come default with Edge. We can go ahead and change them, but just so you know, that's what those are. So let's say, for example, most all the time, this composite yes or no field, which is telling us if this sample is a composite sample or not, is defaulting to N. Maybe that makes sense for the most part of what I want to do. So it'll default to this, but if I have this field showing on the form, if I need to change it for that actual data record, I'm welcome to do that. Let's say, for example, though, for this use of Edge, I know that my depth unit is always going to be in feet. I might as well set that default here. Then anytime this field sample depth unit is going to show up, it's going to default to feet. Now you'll see from many of these existing settings some examples about how to use the lookup. So some of these fields have a lookup that refers to just the name of something. Or you'll see some that have RT in the front, some that don't. Those that are referring to RT are the reference tables coming from Equus. So the matrix code that I'm going to set for my sample, when I go to enter that value, it's going to be looking up to the RT matrix table. That's what this lookup is telling me here. For reference tables, I also need to decide which column in that table has the values I'm going to be choosing from. In this case, it's going to be the matrix code. Now, the matrix code, I happen to know is like a shorthand version of what the matrix is. So like a 2-letter code for groundwater versus soil samples versus surface water samples. It might be helpful for my end users to have a little more information than just these kind of cryptic abbreviations in dropdown. That's what this include column property is. I can choose another field from the same RT matrix table. In this case, it comes with a matrix description field, which, as the name implies, gives me more details about what that matrix is. And I can change this if I need to by selecting this drop-down and choosing from the different, the different fields coming from RT matrix. Okay, while we're talking about lookups, I'll just mention that other of our fields can be set up to look up to enumerations. This sample source one is an enumeration. Now I could point another one to the other enumeration that I had set up before. In fact, maybe I'll do that as an example. I had set up a pretty simple listing of weather conditions. So if I come down to my weather condition fields, I could select from this drop-down, and instead of having this out-of-the-box weather condition enumeration, I can find my weather descriptor. Let's see. Okay. It looks like I'll need to save my changes. Maybe exit out of the tool and then come back in order to change that at this point. So I'll leave that be for the sake of time. But that's where we would change where this is looking up. You'll find some fields as well can look up to other sections in the Edge format. Let's take a look at the parent sample code as an example. So this is configured to look kind of recursively back to the same table where I am, the field sample section. And the lookup column, or the value that we're going to be choosing, is the syssample code. So in essence, this is going to be showing me a list of all of the sample IDs that I've already defined in my EDD, so that I can grab a parent sample for the, for this, say, a field duplicate that I'm defining right then. I'm going to use this as an example of how we can also filter these drop-downs. It makes sense to me that any parent sample code that I'm going to be choosing would be a normal sample. I probably wouldn't expect to try and grab a field duplicate as a parent sample, as an example. If that makes sense to you, then we can go ahead and have this drop-down filter based on some sort of criteria that we set. So under filter column, let me pull this drop-down. This gives us all the same listing of fields that are in this field sample section of the format. What I'm looking for is some sort of a sample type. So if I scroll down a bit to the S's, I have a sample type code. So I'm telling it to filter this based on the sample type code, and the value I want to see is N. I happen to know that that's the code for the normal sample type. So setting this up means that as I click on the parent sample code field, it'll pull down a drop-down list, and it'll show me all of the normal syssample codes that are listed there. Okay, there are other properties that I don't have time to show you right today. The foreign filter column that's over on the right-hand side and the related filter column do something pretty similar to what I did in the filter column and filter value. But instead of setting it here in the config tool and having it be pretty static, instead over here I decide I can make it fairly dynamic to what's in the form. So if I know I'm going to be entering a value in a certain field, and I'd like the drop-down on another field to filter with whatever I chose in the first one, that's what I would use these for. And we have documentation that explains the details about how that works. The last thing I want to mention is that you can set additional fields to be required beyond what's already there. So if I need my parent sample code to be required, which I probably wouldn't do that actually, I can check this box and Edge will highlight it as an error if I leave it blank. The fields that have this blue highlighting in the background are held as required by default in the Edge format, and I can't unset that property. But I can make any other fields that I want to be held as required. Like maybe I want the depth units to be always populated. Okay, so those are the main things we can do with our sample, our format sections here. I will mention as well that we've been working in this columns tab. There's also a file attachment tab. Now Edge comes out of the box with a number of these format sections configured for a file attachment. So in this case, since file attachment is enabled and set up, that means that I can attach photos or any other kinds of files to specific sample records in my EDD. If I were to look over at the location table, I'd have it set up as well with a few changes in this place code and place subcode, but generally set up so that we can attach files to location records instead. Okay, so that's format sections. Let's go down to tabs and talk about this. So tabs, we've already talked in previous sessions about how to choose which tabs you want to show on in Edge. This goes a little step further in a couple of ways. We can take any of the tabs that we want to show and change the caption, and if it's a form, the form's title. Let's take this activity form, for example. Rather than having this activity form 2 showing, we have the tab show up with a little bit of shorthand, well inspect maint, but the form itself have a title of well inspection and maintenance. I can change that at any time. So maybe if I wanted to have this maintenance written out, if I can type correctly, then I can change that here. If you find that Edge is a little bit lethargic to start up, then you could consider coming into this dialog and unchecking any tabs that you know you're never going to use. So like the CFC analysis, CFC historical, contract mag, data provider. Like I don't know what these are, and I'm not really interested because I already have the set of say 5 or 6 forms that I really want to use all the time. If I go ahead and uncheck those, then it can help improve the startup time for Edge. We also won't see any of these unchecked tabs in the show hide tabs chooser that we've talked about in previous sessions. So making it a little bit easier to select the right tabs to show in Edge. Okay, the last thing you can do here is to define a location type. Now, this is referring to collecting data on a certain form. Like I mentioned before, you could, as an example, we could make Edge basically enforce that we should only be using a groundwater form, a form that's tailored specifically for groundwater data or groundwater sampling data. And we should only use that form for locations where we would actually have groundwater samples. So let's take this, one of our field sample forms is already set up as a groundwater form. This would be a good example to do. Let me head over to this location type field. Now if I pull a drop down, I have a checklist items, or a checklist of items here of certain location types that are defined in Equus. So for this case, with groundwater sampling, I know I'm not going to be taking groundwater samples from soil borings or from surface water sampling locations. So for this case, checking this monitoring well only is the choice for me. What this means is that if I were to accidentally or purposefully select a location that wasn't a monitoring well and then try to start a record on this groundwater sampling form, Edge would prevent me from doing so and explain why with a pop-up error message. Okay, the last few things I wanted to mention are some other kind of miscellaneous items that you can configure with Edge, with this configuration tool. Under Captions, these are essentially fields that you'll see throughout Edge. Alerts is referring to errors, like an error summary field. It's a field that you'll see in a number of places that basically adds up how many errors there are on a certain data row. So if you want this to instead read as errors instead of alerts, then we could enter that here. And location name and time are pretty self-explanatory there. There are a few things on the bottom that I'll mention. EDP options includes ways that you can change which color highlighting is used for which variety of error. So if you really don't want to have required fields highlighted in red, you'd rather have them highlighted in mauve, then you could change that in that dialog. The ignore error dialog, or option here, for this, the way I would explain this is that there are a number of different places where Edge can highlight errors for you. To show you what that is, I'm going to hop over to another instance of Edge, just so I can show you the main body of Edge here. When we're entering data, we'll see a number of different kinds of errors highlighted for us, like these red missing required fields, or something in blue giving us a warning about end depth needing to be greater than the start depth. But you'll notice that when I have errors present on a form or a tab, then that tab is highlighted in red. Also, given that I have some of these data errors at a certain location, let's see what location this is. So like B32 has some data errors I need to resolve. There's a feature in Edge that will also, over in the location chooser, show this alerts as an error, meaning I have some sort of a data error at this location. It's this location-based error summary and the tab-based error summary that I can choose to disable for certain error types. So let me go back to the ignore error dialog here. So let's say, for example, if there is some sort of kind of obscure error warning that is here, I'd rather not have the tab itself and the location marked with an error if this is the only thing that's wrong with it. Maybe there's this number 2 is warning me that a field should not be populated. If I were to select this and then click OK, that means that if that was the only problem with that data row or with that form, then I wouldn't necessarily get that big obtrusive red highlighting at the form title or for the location on the left. So anyway, that's a crash course on that dialog there. Now, last but not least, after everything that we've done in this session, as well as in previous sessions about configuring and setting up Edge, it would be a bummer to have to do this again on a new version of Edge. Now, we don't have to do that because of these set of tools over here: settings migration, replace config, and update enumeration. Now, these buttons will allow us to, when we're ready, essentially migrate in all of these configuration and settings changes we've made into a new version. So when I get Edge 7, I want to configure it the same way that I've already done all the work to set up, then I would use these tools to do that. Okay, and that is the end of my presentation. So I will hand it over to Emily. We can discuss any questions that you have.
Great, thanks, Eric. I don't see any questions yet. Let me see if any hands are up. I don't see any hands up either. I'll give people just another moment or two in case they're furiously typing questions in the questions pane. And thanks everyone for attending. Eric, thank you very much for presenting, and we hope to see you all at our next office hour.
Thank you, everyone.
Thanks, guys.